Good morning. I'm Chris Teutsch from University of Kentucky's Research and Education Center located in Princeton, Kentucky. And it's a pleasure to be back with you guys at Grazing for Profit Conference. And I'm going to be talking about forage management for a changing climate this morning. My contact information is below. Please feel free to contact me if you ever have any questions. So there's a couple things I want to talk about, and the first one is just some long-term weather patterns to kind of set the stage for the rest of this talk. Talk about strategies for managing drought and grazing systems. And then we'll go kind of the other side of the extreme and talk about strategies for producing high-quality hay within grazing systems. And then we'll finish up talking about strategies for reclaiming damaged pastures after a winter like we've had this year. This is some data from Matthew Dixon at our Ag Weather Center in Lexington, Kentucky. And Matthew looked at the top 10 wettest years in Kentucky from 1895 to 2020. And what he found was that 5 of those 10 years have occurred since 2011. That's pretty amazing. So what we're seeing is an increase in annual precipitation in Kentucky. And this is the change in annual precipitation. As you can see, the eastern half of the United States has been increasing in the amount of annual precipitation it reads. So states like Kentucky and Tennessee have actually been receiving more annual rainfall than they have in the past. This is a USDA plant hardiness zone, and this was the 1990 map on the left, and on the right is the 2015 map. What I want you to notice is that the plant hardiness zones have shifted northward. So if you look at Kentucky, for example, last one it was in a zone 6. And now we're in zone 7. What does that mean? That means that our average winter temperatures are becoming more mild, so we're not getting as cold. And that's leading to a change in the type of forage plants that we see in pastures. So what was not adapted here at one time is becoming better adapted as we move into the future. And that's going to have an impact on how we managed mixed grass pastures. So the first thing I want to talk about today is a little bit about drought in grazing ecosystems. So there was a study that was done by Dickerson and Diether in 1970, so that's a long time ago, right? But I think what they found kind of still holds true. They found that you have a moderate drought one out of every 5 years, and a severe drought 1 out of every 10 years. Yet it always seems to be a surprise to us, like we've never seen one of those happen before, right? In actuality, drought is a part of our agricultural landscape, and we need to be thinking about how we manage pastures, not just when we're in a drought, but every day so that we can build tolerance and resilience in our grazing systems so that when we do have a drought, that our pastures grow longer into that drought and they come out of that drought faster. Now, one thing I want to stress is that drought rarely kills a well-managed pasture. Unfortunately, not all of our pastures are well-managed in the transition zone of the United States. I kind of think about drought like the straw that broke the camel's back. So say we have a pasture and we planted a marginally adapted forage species or variety in that pasture. Maybe our stocking rate's a little bit higher than it should be. Our soil fertility, well, we kind of let it go, and it's not ideal. And then we haven't been implementing good grazing management. We've been kind of continuously stocking our pasture. And then a moderate drought comes along. And it's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. So I've got all these other stresses on my pasture, and then I add that moderate drought stress, and everyone says, the drought killed my pasture. No, not really. It's probably the accumulation of all the poor management that happened before that drought. And that drought was just that final straw that caused that pasture to fail. So my point is that when we think about a drought management plan, we need to think about removing as many of these stresses as possible from our pasture so that our pastures are more resilient when a drought does come. So we can't predict or prevent a drought from happening, but what we can do is we can manage to mitigate the impact of drought when it does come and manage in a way that's going to promote recovery after that drought goes. So the first thing I want to talk about is setting a sustainable stocking rate. And unfortunately, a lot of farms that I go on to are stocked a little bit too high. I want to take just a minute and kind of go over this graph with you. And what you see on the bottom axis is stocking rate. And as you move from left to right, we're increasing stocking rate. And then there's two lines on the graph. If you look here, the solid line is output per unit land area. So we can kind of think of that as beef per acre. And then this one would be output per individual animal. So that's how fast or how much those animals are growing. And as we increase stocking rate, individual animal performance decreases. That's what this dotted line shows. So as we increase our stocking rate, individual animal performance decreases. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if we have a very light stocking rate, even though individual animals are gaining well, we're not gaining a lot per acre, and that's costing us money. So as we increase stocking rate, output per unit land area tends to increase. And where these two lines cross at, that's kind of the sweet spot in terms of our stocking rate. And it's just not that exact spot, but it's a zone around that spot that's impacted, like things like climate and forage type and soil type and economics and so forth. So it's a kind of a zone around that spot where those two lines crosses is what is our optimal stocking zone. Unfortunately, a lot of farms are past that. And when we get past this optimal stocking rate, then the whole system crashes and burns. Individual animal performance continues to decrease, and output per unit land area decreases very rapidly. So the system becomes unstable when we're in this overgrazing or overstocked situation. So there's lots of factors that impact stocking rate, and it's things like soil resource, rainfall, how we're managing grazing are all important factors. And for our area of the country in the transition zone, if we're somewhere between 2 and 4 acres per cow-calf unit, we're going to be in pretty good shape. 2's pushing it a little bit. 3 would be ideal if we want to extend grazing and feed less hay in our grazing systems. And hay is, in most cases, more negatively correlated with profitability in cow-calf systems. So adjusting our stocking rate to make sure that it's sustainable is important. Our next step to relieve another stress from the system is to get a soil test and adjust soil fertility as needed. Some nutrients are more important than others when it comes to drought stress, and potassium is especially important because it's involved in water relations within the plant. So maintain phosphorus and potassium in the medium soil test range. And we want to maintain our soil pH in that range of 6 to 6.4 in most cases, 6.5 to 6.8 if we have alfalfa within our grazing system. Maintaining proper soil fertility promotes not just shoot growth, but root growth also, which is important for drought stress because we want a strong and healthy root system that's exploring a large soil volume for moisture as things start to get dry. And again, we're removing that stress of soil fertility from the pasture, making that pasture more tolerant of moderate drought stress. The other thing the soil fertility does is that it makes that pasture ready to grow after that rain comes. So everything's in good shape. The rain comes, it replenishes the soil moisture, and that pasture can recover very quickly. So the third thing I want to talk about is rotational stocking, and that doesn't sound like much of a drought management strategy, right? But it is a very important one. In fact, probably one of the most important ones that we can talk about when it comes to drought management. One of the things that good grazing management does is that it allows for a healthy root system, and we do that by preventing overgrazing. What we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below the soil. So when I overgraze the top of the plant so it's down like a tabletop, then I'm negatively impacting what's below the ground. I'm making that root system smaller. When that root system's smaller, that pasture is going to be more susceptible to drought stress. One of the first things that people notice when they switch from a continuous to rotational stocking system is that continuous grazed pastures are more susceptible to that drought stress. Rotationally grazed pastures grow longer into that drought stress and come out of that drought stress faster. And it does it for several reasons. One, our root system's bigger, but second one is that we're maintaining a positive carbohydrate status or positive energy status in that plant. And that's allowing that plant to adjust to that drought stress. And we do that by resting our pastures between grazing events. So we're managing how close we graze that pasture, that solar panel. We want to keep a big solar panel. And we're also managing how long we rest between grazing events. So the second thing that we manage is that residual leaf area. And what we're really managing is photosynthesis, right? So the larger the leaf area is that we leave in that pasture, the faster that pasture is going to regrow. If we graze it right down to the soil surface, that solar panel or that leaf area becomes very small, and it's going to take longer for that pasture to recover. The other thing that happens when we graze very close is that we tend to increase soil temperature, and that increases soil moisture loss. We're also shading the crown of the plant, so we're modifying that microclimate so that it's less harsh. Temperatures are lower on the crown of that plant, and that helps it to survive that moderate drought stress. And then when the rain finally comes, we can get what we almost would view in a calf as compensatory growth, right? So our pastures were not overgrazed during the drought stress. They're ready to grow. The water comes, and we can get very fast recovery in those pastures. This was just an example of the impact of defoliation height and frequency on the drought tolerance of this tall fescue stand. So this was at the Tidewater Research Station in the southeastern part of Virginia. And this was a tall fescue trial that I was doing. And the farm crew was helping me maintain that tall fescue trial by mowing around it. So they mowed frequently, and they mowed very close to the soil surface. And as you can see, as we got below 2-inch cutting height in this tall fescue stand, they killed that tall fescue around this plot of tall fescue, which we harvested at 3 to 4 inches. So cutting height and frequency is very important in terms of maintaining pastures during drought stress. We don't want to graze those pastures too close. We want to let them go into that drought with some residual leaf area. So this is an older study by Kreider. It was done in the 1950s, and it looked at root growth impact as it was impacted by defoliation. So when we remove 50% of the shoots in the plant, root growth stops. When we have a single removal of 90%, root growth stopped for 17 days. So if I had 10 inches of forage, I removed 9, root growth stopped for over 2 weeks. If I clip those plants 3 times a week, and that's kind of what you would find in a continuous stocking system, every time they grow a little bit, the animals are there to clip or eat that forage off, root growth never resumed. When I remove 40% or less of the shoots, then the root growth was not impacted. And that's kind of where we come up with this general rule of take half and leave half. A lot of people talk about now top third grazing, where you remove the top third of the canopy. And that fits in perfect with this, right? We're saying remove 40% or less of the shoots, and we don't impact root growth. All right, another strategy that we can use is to incorporate drought-tolerant legumes into grazing systems. Alfalfa is probably one of the biggest ones. It's a high-yielding, long-lived perennial forage, often referred to as queen of the forages. Sometimes I call it pouty princess, and the reason I call it pouty princess is that it really has a specific type of soils that it's adapted to. They have to be deep, well-drained, and fertile. And what I just described is not most of our pasture soils, right? Most of our pasture soils are shallow, kind of marginal in fertility, and drouthy. You know, in soils that have no rooting restrictions, tap roots on alfalfa can be 15 to 30 feet deep. They found them coming through the tops of mine shafts out west where there was no restrictions to rooting in the soils. Generally, we would have to mix it with the grass to reduce our chances of bloat, and it really needs to be rotationally stocked because of its carbohydrate cycle. I just want to mention Sericea lespedeza. It's a long-lived perennial warm-season legume, often thought of as a weed, but we find it on a lot of reclaimed mine land in lower input situations. Often referred to as poor man's alfalfa. This is Burton Allen, and Burton Allen had been harvesting Sericea lespedeza for hay for a long, long time. And that's a challenge because it's got, fairly thick stems, and by the time the stems get dry, the leaves are so brittle that they shatter very badly when you bale them. So you have to be very careful when you bale Sericea lespedeza hay. It is very tolerant of lower fertility and pH. Palatability can be an issue if we're going to graze it. We always want to keep it below our knees. We do lose some of the tannins that cause it to be less palatable during the curing process for hay. Has poor seedling vigor, so it really needs to be established alone and then a grass sown back into it. Needs to be rotationally stocked. There's really only one named variety available. It's available from Sims Brothers Seeds. It's called AU Grazer. Was selected at Auburn University under Grazing. It's medium level in tannins. And again, we find it in road cuts and reclaimed mine land, so areas where the fertility and soil structure and so forth is kind of marginal. So I want to talk a little bit about incorporating warm season grasses into grazing systems as a drought management strategy. So we can see on the top here, we've got our cool season grasses. They have a bimodal forage distribution, which means a hump of growth in the spring, hump of growth in the fall, not much going on in the summertime when growth is temperature limited. If we look at our warm season grasses in contrast, all that growth is concentrated right in the middle of the summer months. So these grasses have the ability to take advantage of small amounts of water during the summer months when cool season grasses don't respond to that small amount of water. Warm season grasses will in general produce about twice as much dry matter per unit of water used compared to cool season grasses. And we can see how having some of these in our system, not in the same pastures in most cases, but in separate pastures, could really complement cool season grasses. It would allow us to get animals off of cool season grasses, allow them to rest during the winter months and summer months and not graze them too closely. And that will help them survive a drought stress. And also fill that summer slump in. These warm season grasses do a good job of providing forage when these cool season grasses are not actively growing. So I just want to mention our traditional ones, and they include things like pearl millet, sorghum Sudan grass, and then if we're making conserved silage, we could use a forage sorghum. These are all warm season grasses, and again, they're fairly easy to establish. They tend to have very vigorous growth during the summer months. The one thing we have to be careful when we talk about annual grasses and grazing systems is they tend to be expensive compared to a perennial pasture species. So we want to use these sparingly within grazing systems. We certainly don't want a grazing system based solely on annual grasses. Just wanted to mention crabgrass, and that's another summer annual grass. And again, it is truly an annual, so it's got to come back from seed every year. Well adapted to this region of the country. It's a prolific reseeder, so it kind of acts like a perennial because it produces a lot of seed that falls onto the soil surface and germinates and comes up that following year. If we're going to use it alone in a grazing system, we really need to double crop it with some type of winter annual. My favorite would be crabgrass, but small grains can work also. Has good yield potential and excellent forage quality. If you have it in a system where you're finishing animals or developing heifers or some or grazing dairy, and you need higher quality forage, then this may be a good choice for you. Has no prussic acid but can accumulate nitrates under very high nitrogen fertilization. Just want to mention Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is well adapted to this whole Mid-South region. It's relatively little was planted in the northern transition zone, and that goes back to this idea that you have to establish improved varieties from sprigs and sprigging. So we actually dig up pieces of the plant, transport them to a tilled field, work them into the soil, and that's how we establish improved Bermuda grasses. There has been the development of improved seeded Bermuda grasses with better cold tolerance, and they can be established like any other small seeded forage. They come two ways: as either one single cultivar in the bag, but more commonly they're a blend of several cultivars. So we want to make sure that the cultivars that are in the blend that are listed on the seed tag are adapted to where we're trying to grow it at, and we want to avoid blends that have Arizona Common and Giant, because those two types of Bermuda grass are cheap, and seed companies love to put them in blends, but they're not well adapted, and we usually see those die that first winter. So one of the tricky things about the blends is that they're marketed with the same trade name every year, but they can be different things in the bag. So make sure and check the seed tag to make sure that you're getting the cultivars that you think are in that blend. Just want to mention native warm season grasses, and they have a very deep and prolific root system. And they're a favorite in NRCS cost share programs, and they can provide good summer grazing. The one caution is that we can't manage these like we manage a tall fescue pasture, or they won't persist. We've got to manage for the native warm season grasses in that grazing system, which includes rotational stocking and not grazing too close. Common ones include switchgrass, Indian grass, big and little bluestem, and eastern gamagrass. Eastern gamagrass is best adapted to less well-drained areas, along creek bottoms and so forth. Big and little bluestem and Indian grass are a mixture that NRCS likes to promote for grazing and wildlife. So another strategy for managing drought in grazing systems is to irrigate pastures. And this increases pasture growth sometimes by 3 to 5 times the amount you would get if you're in a moderate drought stress. The problem is there's a large upfront cost with irrigation, and then you may not use it every year because we are in a high humid environment, so maybe you use it every 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, but you're still paying for that infrastructure each year. Now, it's kind of a different game if you have existing infrastructure for irrigation. So if I'm on a farm that formerly had tobacco and I've got pipe and a pump and I've got ponds dug already, then it may make sense during a drought to irrigate some of those pastures that are close to the water sources to get you through that drought. One thing I want to make sure people understand about irrigation is that it's not easy. It sounds easy, but if you've ever irrigated, it's a lot of work, and you've got to babysit it, and you've got to make sure things don't go wrong. And it turns into be a tremendous amount of work. If you do decide to use this as a mitigation strategy for drought in your grazing system, then we really need to be irrigating warm season grasses because they're going to give us about twice as much growth per unit of water used. And there are some new technology like these pasture pods, and they're not really new, but they've been around a while. And the videos are great. I love watching the videos where they pull these pasture pods around in pastures with the four-wheeler. And this is viable, but it always looks easier than a video than it actually is. And even if we buy this pod system, we still have to have lines going out to the pasture to deliver the water that will be distributed through the pods. Okay, probably our biggest drought management strategy is to feed conserved forage, right? So we have a love-hate relationship with hay, right? Hay is a necessary evil within grazing systems. We want to work hard to minimize the amount of conserved forage that we're feeding, but we when we need it, we need to have it. And that's important. And this is an important drought management strategy. So it doesn't mean, because we're trying to reduce the amount of hay in our system, that we'll never need hay. But the question comes is, should we own $250,000 worth of equipment to make it, or should we just be buying it? And I think in most cases, for small and moderate beef cattle operations, we really need to be thinking about just buying a decent quality hay and then storing it somewhere that's off the ground and out of the weather. And hay will stay viable or good for a long time if it's stored off the ground and out of the weather. The key to using hay as a drought mitigation strategy is that we really need to feed it before we damage our pastures. And your neighbors are going to make fun of you because you're challenging the paradigm that you still have grass, so you should be grazing. You're challenging that paradigm because you're feeding hay when you still have some cover in pastures. And your neighbors will say, look at that nut bag. He's over there feeding hay when he's still got grass left. But when the rain comes, and the rain will come, your pastures are going to recover very quickly when your neighbor's pastures that he grazed into the ground will not have any growth on them, even after the rain. So the key is feed before damaging your pastures, and then feed before losing condition on animals. You want to make sure your animals stay in good condition. Body condition score, calving, is the number one factor impacting rebreeding in livestock. And then feed in your weakest pastures. So choose a pasture that you know is in need of renovation or needs some extra fertility, and bring that hay in and feed it in those areas so that we can capture the value of those nutrients in that hay. Every ton of hay contains about $50 worth of nutrients. So another strategy is early weaning, and we want to try to avoid weaning calves before 100 to 120 days, is what my animal scientist friends tell me. And this has, when we wean a calf early, it has twofold effect. We're reducing the total number of animal units, and we're reducing the nutrient requirements of the dam. And that's going to improve the condition of the dam, which can be important in drought years. Remember, we want her to be in that range of 5 to 6 when she calves. So we don't want her to be thin. And this is just an example. This is a nutritional requirement of a 1,300-pound cow. If she's lactating, she's going to need 29 pounds of dry matter, 60% TDN, and 11% crude protein. If she is dry, so not nursing a calf, she's going to need 24 pounds of dry matter, 50% TDN, and 7% crude protein. So that's a reduction of 16% in the amount of dry matter that she's eating, 17% reduction in energy, and a 36% reduction in crude protein. So I just threw that up there because I want you to understand that when you take that calf off, it's not only reducing the animal units, but it's also reducing the nutrient requirements of that animal. The last option, in one of the most least palatable options, in my opinion, is destocking. And people work hard on developing their herds and the genetics that they have in their herds, and it's just not a fun option to have to sell animals. So it's kind of my last option. One thing to consider when we get into a drought, if we want to reduce the amount of animal units on the farm, is thinking about culling some of those animals that we may have let slip in the system. So it could be on the basis of reproduction, functionality, production, disposition, or maybe the animal just doesn't fit your system. Maybe she's too big. Ideally, in a grass-based system, we'd want moderate-sized cows. We don't want real tiny ones, but we don't want ones that weigh 1,800 pounds either. And it was interesting. I was in Virginia a few weeks ago, and I was talking about cow size in one of my presentations. And I said, well, maybe cows aren't 1,250 pounds anymore. Maybe they're 1,350 or 1,400. Someone came up to me during the break and said, I sold 2 cull cows last week. They were 1,800 pounds. That's a monster. That's too big for a grazing system. Ideally, we'll make decisions based on long-term records, so I hope you have good records. And then you want to make sure if we're going to cull animals, do it before the market gets flooded with a bunch of animals and prices go down. Okay, that's it on drought. I want to change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about producing high-quality hay in a changing environment. Whenever I talk about hay, I'd like to set the stage by talking about cow-calf production costs. And this is a graph, and this is a survey of 170 farms. It was done at the Farm Business Management Institute, University of Minnesota. And what it looks at is the different pieces in the cow-calf budget. And what I want to point out here is this big piece of the pie, this orange one. This is 49% of the cow-calf budget. Hay and feed make up usually between 40 and 60% of the total cow-calf budget. If we're going to remain profitable when calf prices come down, we have got to control this. We have got to look at this biggest piece of the budget and say, how can we reduce this piece of the budget? And we do that by extending grazing in the system. So if we're going to remain profitable, we really need to be thinking about hay and feed. Hay is almost always negatively correlated with profitability in cow-calf systems. So this is scary, right? But even scarier is when I looked at the average production costs for a cow-calf unit for these 170 farms, it was over $1,000 per cow-calf unit. You're okay now. You're making a little money now if you're at this level. But remember, this is an average, right? So that means half the farms are above and half are below. Everybody knows what an average is, right? Average is like having 2 buckets of water, one scalding hot, one ice cold. You put a foot in each bucket. On average, you're comfortable, but it hurts like hell. This price scares me. If we're going to be profitable as we move forward in the cow-calf cycle and calf prices adjust, we can't be at $1,000 per cow-calf unit and be profitable. We've got to be below this. So that was scary, but this is even scarier. I'm showing you a bunch of scary stuff today, but I went back into this survey where I got the last 2 pieces of data at. Then went back and I graphed out cow-calf production costs over the last 25 years. And when you look at the increase in the cost of carrying a cow-calf unit, it is truly scary. We are not going to be able to be profitable if we're above this line. We've got to be below this line to remain profitable. And so keep that in mind as you're moving forward. And the biggest piece of that pie is hay and supplemental feed. So if we can reduce that in our system, then we have a better chance of remaining profitable. Daryl Peel at Oklahoma State had a graph in a presentation on hay production per beef cow unit in Oklahoma. And what he showed was an increasing trend in the amount of hay being produced per beef cow unit in Oklahoma. And after I watched that presentation, I asked our USDA stats guys to put a graph like that together for Kentucky. And lo and behold, what I found was that from about the mid-1970s to today, we've seen a steady increase in the amount of hay produced per beef cow unit in Kentucky. That's not good. Remember, hay is negatively correlated in most cases with profitability in beef cow operations. So here we are feeding more and more and more hay every year, and that's not good. Daryl Peel tried to parse this out and look at why we're seeing an increase in hay use. And one of the things he said was that we have bigger cows. And I think that's true, and I think that accounts for a significant portion of the increased hay use that we're seeing. So our cows, we think, are 1,200 pounds, but they may be closer to 1,400 or 1,500 pounds, in some cases more than that. And if that's just an example of the extremes in cattle breeding, we never try to breed for a moderate animal. It's always one extreme or the other. And really, moderation is probably where we need to be in terms of cow size. Increases in wasted hay, so increases in storage and feeding losses, account for a significant portion of this increased hay use. And then a longer total hay feeding period, which is counterintuitive to the climate that we're experiencing now. We've been experiencing a climate with milder winters and increased rainfall, so we should be grazing more days of the year. We've got to really sit down and think about how we can capture those additional grazing days in our systems. Okay, whenever I talk about hay, I always like to start out and talk just a little bit about what hay quality means. And we try to define hay quality with lots of different terms. We look at acid turgid fiber, neutral turgid fiber, crude protein, in vitro true digestibility, but really the essence of what hay quality is the ability of that forage to produce a desired animal response. And that's a moving target, right? So what's a good hay for a brood cow is not a good hay for a dairy cow or for a pleasure horse. So we've got to kind of figure out what we need. These are nutrient requirements of various animal classes. And as you can see, they vary widely in both the terms of crude protein and total digestible nutrients, depending on the animal class. But even within an animal class, the stage of the production cycle can have a dramatic impact on the nutritional requirements of an animal. If we look at a dry beef cow, she can get by on 7 or 8% crude protein, whereas a lactating cow has to have 10 to 12% crude protein. And same way with energy. And we estimate energy using total digestible nutrients for beef cattle. And if we have 50%, that's enough for a dry brood cow that's gestating. If a cow is actively lactating, then we need 60% TDN to meet her energy requirements for her to maintain body condition during that lactation period. So my point of this chart is not that you should memorize all these numbers, but that you need to define what level of hay quality you need in your system and then work towards that level of hay quality. If I'm in a brood cow system, I don't need dairy quality hay. If I'm in a dairy system, then I do need dairy quality hay. So the single most important factor impacting forage quality is stage of maturity at harvest. Hands down. Not species, not fertilization, not the time of the day when I cut that hay. It's stage of maturity at harvest. As that plant matures, the quality goes down. And that's what this graph is showing. So we go from, on this side of the graph, a leafy vegetative forage to a forage that's stemmy and at full and producing viable seed. As we do that, digestibility decreases and dry matter intake decreases. The reason I like to use this graph is that I want people to understand that it's more than just digestibility. So the forage quality is lower, but also the animal can eat less of it. So it can't eat more to make up for that lower forage quality. So it kind of puts the double whammy on that animal in terms of not having a lower quality or diet, plus being able to eat less of that diet. So the good part about this, as we move from leafy to viable seed being produced, is that we maximize our yield. And ideally, where we need to be at is where these lines cross at. So we want to be at early seed head for grasses, and then early to mid bloom for legumes. And if we're there, we have a good compromise between quality and yield. Unfortunately, a lot of us are making what I like to refer to as Independence Day hay. It's closer to Independence Day than when it should actually be harvested. And we're maximizing our yield, but it's a really poor quality product. That's not going to meet the nutritional requirements of our animals without some type of supplementation. This is from AGR 62 Quality Hay Production, and it looks at the effective stage of maturity of tall fescue hay on forage quality and gain in the animal. So if I look at crude protein, for example, it's at the late boot when I should be cutting that hay, it's 13.8%. When the seed's forming, it's 7.6%. Look at digestibility, it goes from 68 to 56%. Dry matter intake decreases from 13 pounds, so the animal's able to eat 13 pounds of that, these growing steers, per day. And when the seed's forming, they can only eat 8 to 8.6 pounds. And that translates into animal performance. So on these steers, when we fed them hay that was harvested in the late boot stage, they gained about 1.4 pounds a day versus 0.4 pounds when we fed them hay that was with the seed forming. Why don't we do a better job? We know how important, and this is not the first time you guys have ever heard this, we know how important stage of maturity is at harvest, but yet we do a poor job of getting it cut at the correct stage of maturity. And there's lots of reasons. You know, a lot of us work off the farm, so whoever's writing our check is going to get first billing. And cattle are often a secondary enterprise on many farms. So if I've got tobacco is going to get set and plowed and laid by before I make my hay, and that's going to impact the forage quality. Older, poorly maintained equipment. I grew up on a farm in Northeast Ohio. I never even knew they made new hay equipment. You know, and there's a reason for that, is that new hay equipment's expensive. Poor conditions combined with a heavy first crop at cutting often delay harvesting at the correct stage of maturity. And that's probably our biggest single factor, is weather. So this is available baling days, and there tend to be decreasing. If I look at Lexington, for example, we went from 5.5 to 4. That's a 1.5 baling day decrease. You're saying, well, it's only a baling day and a half, but when you only start out with 5.5, I mean, that's a 20% decrease in baling days. And a baling day is defined as 3 curing days followed by a 4th day on which the weather is good to bale that hay up. So we're seeing fewer baling days than we've had before, and that's making it more difficult to get dry hay up. So the question becomes is, how do we manage for high quality hay in a changing environment when we have even fewer baling days? And the answer is simple. We've got to shorten that period between when we cut it and when we get it in the bale. And there's 2 ways to do that. We either speed up curing, so we use a mower conditioner, which can help speed up. We make the windrow wider that comes out of the mower conditioner. We ted the hay, but somehow we've got to help it lose moisture at a faster rate. Or we bale hay at a higher moisture. And we can do that by using some hay preservatives or by using baleage. And baleage is probably one of our best options. Baleage allows us to cut hay one day, bale it, and wrap it the next day. And that shortens that period significantly from when we cut it to when we get it in the bale. And that allows us to harvest in a more timely manner, which is going to increase forage quality. A lot of people out there are using baleage as a rain management tool. So they cut hay with the idea that they're going to bale it as dry hay, right? And usually we want dry hay to be less than 20% moisture at baling. So usually 18% would be ideal for a large round bale. And there's this zone that we've always talked about that's kind of between 20% and 40% moisture, where we say neither hay or silage will work, but producers have been pushing this. And they've been wrapping almost dry hay, and they refer to it as sweet hay. It kind of goes through a partial fermentation. And they're using this as a rain management tool. So they're attempting to make dry hay, but if we get close to being dry, but it's not quite there, and it looks like rain's imminent, they'll roll it up and then wrap it with plastic. So we did a study at the research station, evaluated moisture content at baling on the pH and nutritive value of hay that we ensiled. So we ensiled tall fescue all the way from 20 to 80% moisture. So standing forage is about 80% moisture. Hay that's dry enough to go into a bale is about 20% moisture. And then we evaluated the pH as an indicator of fermentation, and then the nutritive value, crude protein, and energy. And this is what we found. So As we increased dry matter added ensiling from 20 to almost 90%, so we were dry enough for hay here, a little bit too wet for silage here. This is our ideal range for making silage, 55 to 65% moisture. What we found was as dry matter increased, silage pH decreased, so fermentation became less. So we weren't getting that reduction in pH. And that's what preserves silage, is that reduction in pH, the formation of sugars into lactic acid. So again, we were right where we need to be in this ideal range, around somewhere between 5 and 5.5 is what we would expect for a grass bale age. But when we get above that, then that fermentation slowed down. When we looked at the impact of dry matter and ensiling on total digestible nutrients, what we found was that it had very little impact. As long as we excluded oxygen from that system by wrapping that bale well, or stealing that oxygen out of that forage, even if it was drier than the ideal range for making silage, we still preserved that forage well. Now, one thing that will be reduced is aerobic stability. So that forage will decline faster once air is introduced back into the system. So once that bale is opened up, we really need to feed it out quickly. It doesn't have the same aerobic stability as a silage that would have a pH of 5. Okay, let's switch gears once more, and I just want to finish up by talking about 3 approaches to reclaiming pugged up pastures. Lord knows we've got pugged up pastures this year. We had in western Kentucky multiple rainfall events that were 3+ inches. We had one that was close to 6, and it's been a long, miserable, wet, messy winter. And we've got a lot of pastures that are pugged up and a lot of hay feeding areas that need reclaimed. So I want to talk about 3 options for doing this. And the first one is to plant cool season annuals in the spring. And these would include things like the cereals, wheat, cereal rye, oats, and annual ryegrass can all work. And we would ideally seed those in March, but usually by the time things get cleaned, dried out, and then we get things leveled out, it's usually closer to mid-April or May, and that's really pretty late for a cool season annual. So we have a very limited window of productivity. And then, of course, they're not productive during the summer months. So we're going to get a bunch of summer annual weeds in those areas. So to me, this is probably not the best option. It is an option, but it's probably not the best one. I think we've got a couple more viable options. In having said this, one exception may be a combination of annual ryegrass and crabgrass in some of these areas. So we're going to get the animals off as early as we can, smooth the impacted areas, and then overseed with 15 to 25 pounds of annual ryegrass, and then mix in 4 to 6 pounds of crabgrass with that. And the idea is that the annual ryegrass provides a very quick cover in the spring, and that's going to last until late May, early June in most cases, when temperature limits annual ryegrass growth. And then that stand will transition into the crabgrass that we included in that mixture from May to early June. And then that crabgrass will be productive until September. So that's the first option. The second option is using cool season perennials, and we commonly see this done, but it has limited success. And these would be things like orchard grass and tall fescue, maybe mixed with some red and white clover. We establish in mid-April to mid-May. Earlier is better if we're going to try to do it, but sometimes it's hard to get in there and get everything leveled out and seeded in a timely manner, so it gets pushed a little bit towards April rather than March. And again, they get up, they have adequate moisture and temperature to get up and form and emerge from the soil, but they really don't get really big before the summer months. And that small root system of that, and then a lot of competition from summer annual weeds like spiny amaranth and cocklebur and crabgrass and goosegrass and foxtails can really cause them to fail during the summer months. So again, not my favorite option for trying to revegetate these highly disturbed areas. I think the third option is probably the best, and that's using warm season annuals. Warm season annuals include things like sorghum Sudan grass, pearl millet, and crabgrass. And what you would do, you get in there in early May to mid-June, kind of get those areas worked up, so it gives you a little bit of time to get them dried out, and then seed those warm season annuals when the soil temperature gets around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're going to get optimal growth during summer months. So they're going to have very aggressive, especially sorghum Sudan grass, is going to have very aggressive growth. It's going to get early canopy closure, and that canopy closure is going to shade weeds out in that stand. So instead of having a bunch of spiny amaranth there, we're going to have a nice closed stand of sorghum Sudan grass. And so it can be very competitive with these summer annual weeds. And then we can come back in the fall and seed our desirable cool season species in these areas. So we want to be at the higher end of the seeding rate if we're going to use this to kind of suppress these summer annual weeds in these highly disturbed areas. So 30 to 40 pounds for sorghum Sudan grass 15 to 20, pearl millet 15 to 20, crabgrass, 5 or 6 pounds. We do have a really nice publication on this. It's AGR 255, Strategies for Reclaiming Hay Feeding Areas. Just simply Google Reclaiming Hay Feeding Areas, UKY, and it'll be the first thing that pops up. That's all I got for you today, guys. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And thank you again for inviting me down to Tennessee to visit with you.